I am a substitute chair till the original chair, Dr. T.M. Thomas Isaac, arrives. He's on his way. But FAS conferences are known to begin on time, so we will begin on time. This is a very fascinating panel, as good as a plenary, but I wish this was a plenary, given the stature of the speakers we have here. We have Barbara Harris-White, we have Deepak Johnson and V. Surjit, who will be speaking on a jointly authored paper. We have Surajit Majumdar, and we have Mihika Chatterjee. So what we will do is, we'll have 20 minutes for each speaker. There are signboards, 5 minutes more and 1 minute more, which are there. So you'll be shown that. Try to sort of, let's try to keep to time, and so that we'll have some time for discussions and questions towards the end. Unlike the plenary, the panel sessions will have questions and answers also. We try to keep 20 minutes to half an hour as much as possible for questions and answers. So please keep your questions ready. You can ask them at the end of it and just try to keep them as brief as possible. So I'm very happy to invite Professor Barbara Harris-White from the University of Oxford to speak to you.
Thank you very much, Professor Ramkumar. In January, I was at IIT Bombay at a conference on contemporary Indian economy, and everybody was talking about post-colonial capitalism. And suddenly I realized that I wasn't sure what post-colonial capitalism actually meant. And I asked one of the main students, foremost students, and he roared with laughter, and he said, "You ought to know what it means because ChatGPT lists you as one of the major authors." At which point, I had to stop what I had planned for this year and find out what post-colonial capitalism means. And I'm grateful to the Foundation for Agrarian Studies, not just for inviting me here, but to Dr. VKR, who said you must speak about post-colonial capitalism in agriculture. So I'm not talking about agriculture. I'm talking about ideas about agriculture. And I hope you'll bear with me. So the year's project is in black, and what I hope to gallop through in the next 20 minutes is what is in red. So I am going to begin. Is there a problem? Thank you. I'm going to begin by figuring out what post-colonial capitalism is post, and then understanding what post-colonial studies has contributed to our understanding of agriculture, and then to turn to Kalyan Sanyal and the critiques of Kalyan Sanyal, and what is left of Kalyan Sanyal after the critiques, in other words, his legacy. But I want to end up on a rather 90-degree twist at the very end, because there is some neo as well as some post going on in scholarship about agriculture. Okay, so I am going to rush through this slide, which is what has been the epistemological basis for scholarship on agrarian capital in the post-independence period. In other words, taking post-colonial as a historical period. All the time we get muddled up between history and a school of thought. And this is a summary of about 10 slides, but many people in this room have already reviewed literature and come to a position about where they feel comfortable theoretically and politically. But if we're looking at the post-colonial critique and why Sanyal argued the way he did, what we have to accept is that in the post-independence period, there were theories used by the colonial state about agricultural development. There was mainstream development economics. There was Marxist theorizing culminating in the mode of production debate, which was never really resolved. There was a separate body of theory, Krishna Bhardwaj, Amit Bhaduri, which were theories of exchange based in class. There are the political projects of parties, which are very varied. And finally, last but not least, perhaps least theorized and most in need of theory, are the categories of the state. So what we can say about this fertile period between independence and when the subalterns get going in about 1978 is that these theories responded to a range of analytical needs, that what resulted was a discursive Tower of Babel. We all need to be linguists. We all need to decode terms of art in order to understand where the theories are located and where they're coming from and what they say about agriculture. But that this is not confined to the study of agriculture. It seems to be normalized in social science, and it's a brilliant example of what Clifford Geertz in Desperation called theoretical diffusion. In other words, when post-colonial studies gets going as a movement, it's faced with this kind of discursive theoretical diffusion. Okay, so what was the insight? Why was this new school of thought necessary? And a little bit of general background before we go to agriculture. The post-colonial studies critique emerged from history and literature. It certainly didn't emerge from economics. And it called for a need to decenter theories from universalism, pointing to the utter disregard for diversity of experience and of institutions, particularly in the South. In the critique of universalism, there was also a subcategory of venom, which was directed at Eurocentrism. The difference from universalism being in the imperialist mindset. So Eurocentrism was in a way failed universalism. It was a flawed neglect. It was theories about development, including agriculture, which neglected the impact of colonialism in the development of Western capitalism, and then after independence in the development of the capitalism in independent countries. It was thirdly a critique of elitism, colonialist elitism and bourgeois nationalist elitism, the difference being whether your elitism was pro-British and imperialist elitism or whether it was pro-Indian elitist response to British colonialism. So it was a critique of the marginalization of agrarian agency, of autonomous agrarian agency, and of the struggles and resistance against the forces of dispossession in particular, which had been neglected up until then in theories of development. Was it a fair critique of agrarian scholarship by then? I don't think it was at all fair. I think that existing agrarian economic history, political economy, sociology, the mode of production debate, labor history, I've developed it elsewhere, or I'm developing elsewhere, but it shows that that simplification was really not a valid one, even though it was applied to agriculture. So how did subaltern and post-colonial studies contribute to our understanding of agriculture? They contributed to a lot of revision of understanding of literature and of history, but we are talking about agriculture, and I am focusing on agricultural capital. Akhil Gupta, in his book Post-Colonial Development, Agriculture in the Making of Modern India, was actually a village-level study, and it had no analysis of the agricultural economy. But in that book, it was argued that agriculture was a vehicle for the post-colonial condition. And what was the post-colonial condition? It was that underdevelopment met the imposition of a populist identity, the other, the small farmer. that is othered by powerful people, which includes everyone in this room. And that the moment you understand and study the other, you find that the other is differentiated and that they have a hybrid agricultural knowledge, grounded actually in the very dichotomous theories that are critiqued. Then we have a body of studies which takes peasants as an autonomous domain for study. And that second strand of post-colonial studies develops discourse, peasant agency against forces of oppression and exploitation. And people like Jan Bremen identify themselves as studying post-colonial labor history. In this body of literature, and Deepesh Chakravarti has made the point, it's a good point, that capital, which is my focus, is actually separated from power. And power is something that may be exercised culturally and not just through the economy. The third body of work in post-colonial studies relevant to us as scholars of agriculture is of the other, that regular theories in all their variety have marginalized. And there's a body of literature on tribal people, Dalit people, we heard about this morning, and gender, which generally means women. And that has been quite enduring, and it has led recently to a second round of theorizing in social reproduction relevant to agrarian conditions. So when it comes to my particular question, which is capital and capitalism, this body of studies doesn't really consider it as a relation. It doesn't abandon capital as a thing, as a class, as business. It doesn't abandon it for a relational concept of capitalism. Rather, landlords and capitalists exist as the other's other. So we study the other, and their other is actually what I'm interested in. So I have 2 slides about caste. I could go through them very quickly, but caste is par excellence a non-universalist form of social authority to which this body of, this school of thought has contributed quite a lot. And the insight is to recognize it as a regulator of agrarian society. And one argument is that the confining of caste to culture and the failure to recognize its hard regulative role in the economy has enabled the persistence of caste control land hierarchies. Another strand of literature, Jens, you've contributed to this, is that of conjugated oppression, and that is that of the caste and class obstacles to Dalits obtaining any land, any assets, upward mobility or class mobility for Dalits. Gail Onvet, I think, is the first person to have enriched our knowledge of caste through the concept, which is much abused, of intersectionality. But what she meant by it was how social hierarchies, not just caste, ethnicity, religion, and gender, are reworked to ensure accumulation in post-colonial agriculture. And we have a fourth body of literature which is very patchy, where agriculture is expanded to the agrarian, and so we have applications to livestock, which has also been marginalized, crop processing. And the main thrust of this literature is the lack of transformation. There's growth, there's technical change, but the lack of structural transformation. Okay. At the same time, and this is not a rabbit hole, if we're looking at the history of ideas in this post-colonial period, leading up to Sanyalian political economy, we have to recognize an independent genealogy, a current of analysis, which is joined by various other streams of argument about caste in the economy. Firstly, a great delay in the recognition of capitalist exploitation mapped onto caste, and a reluctance to recognize caste struggles as forms of class struggle. Then a much stronger statement, in fact an insulting statement about Manavadi Marxism, mainly by Dalit scholars, arguing that The class framework is silent and wrong about caste. It's masking a caste mode of production in which caste is constitutive of the economic base. This is anathema to many Marxists. It cheapens labor, it perpetuates marginalization, the use of merit and status is used to reinforce caste privileges, grab new resources in the non-land economy, and protect economic power through the state. So there are various ways in which this has been framed heretically, but the caste mode of production is certainly one which, if we're looking at the history of ideas, we cannot ignore. Okay, so what is the regular political economy critique of post-colonial studies' contributions to post-colonial agriculture? Clearly, the project in post-colonial agrarian economic history has been incomplete. We can recognize that without having to concede that it's actually wrong. And the counter-argument is that political economy of capitalism in agriculture is universally relevant and locally applicable. Vivek Shiba argued this very strongly. We can argue that the critique itself is selective, and it's certainly not self-critical. We can ask questions about what kind of empowerment do these theories enable, especially when the people who are theorizing are sitting in comfortable offices in America. In arguing for the need to desecularize development, Mirananda has just brought out a book which shows that inadvertently ideas have been handed to Hindutva. How do we decenter economics beyond a critique which is actually universalist of inappropriate assumptions like modernism? Okay, so there's a bundle of good arguments that regular political economy can fire at post-colonial studies. Okay, so now we come to Sanyal, who in 2007 published a book, Rethinking Capitalist Development, Primitive Accumulation, Governmentality, Nod to Foucault, and Post-Colonial Capitalism. What Sanyal was responding to was the call from the mainstream post-colonial critique of a theory which is decentered, and yet at the same time he says it's relevant to the South. A theory centered on dispossession, a theory which is a political economy of the post-colonial era, thinking it in emic terms, in people's own terms, as subject of their own history. So, in a nutshell, what is Sanyal arguing? And I do this in more detail because Sanyal is really the only serious post-colonial political economist that I could find. He is privileging primitive accumulation in agriculture, so it's centered in agriculture. This is a process which started under the colonial era. It's never complete, and so it's the ongoing driver which is constitutive of post-colonial capital, not just in agriculture, but in the entire economy. And the state provides infrastructure which creates labor, which is, as in the classic theory of primitive accumulation, it's free of assets, and it's also free of work, so it has to work. Sanyal builds a unified, what he calls a unified dual economy. On the one hand, we have the capitalist economy, which is, he calls the accumulation economy. Large farmers extracting surplus value from cheap labor and supplying food. Now that accumulation economy grows on its own. By contrast, he has a non-capital space. He calls it a need economy. He also calls it a wasteland, surplus labor, in-between space, excluded people, backward, markets for subsistence, dispossessed people. He calls it the informal economy and a new space. So he's arguing that the need economy is most of the Indian economy. The state taxes agriculture and uses the revenue in order to stop this need economy from starvation. Basically, I'm fast tracking because I will run out of time. How has this theory been critiqued? Firstly, there are 2 points about the other in Sanyalian post-colonial theory. Firstly, there is a discursive critique about the terms used for the need economy, not criticizing the need, but criticizing the terms, calling it a wasteland, everything between the airport and this hotel, the wasteland, the poor, castaways, ancient forms, non-meritorious and even subhuman lives. What kind of decentered solidarity is that? I have to ask myself. The second kind of critique is that of Pranab Bardhan, who makes the point that the need and the accumulation economies are false dichotomies, especially in agriculture. If we look at inputs and outputs, we look at production, consumption, and investment. Even if we believe in formality and informality, we cannot separate an accumulation economy and a need economy. The second big critique is about primitive accumulation and the claim that it's decentered. It's also translated from the German as primary or original, and it owes a debt to the very universalist Marxism that the post-colonial people are criticizing. Again, Pranab Bardhan argues that it certainly hasn't been the major driver of growth, as it has to be in that theory, and that miniaturization, which we see in many of the papers already in this conference, is not the same as primitive accumulation. And Kalyan Sanyal is muddling up logical and historical space. He requires the reversing of primitive accumulation in the need economy from people who haven't necessarily been dispossessed of the means of production. And it goes on. I'm going to leap across this, although my head is a bit on the block, because the other way of reacting to the binary classification of accumulation versus need is to address the hornet's nest of whether peasants are peasants anymore, which is what he calls them, or whether they're petty commodity producers, which is what this slide is about. And the critique goes on. I don't have time. But I want to make two points. What is left of Sanyal after the critiques, which are fairly fundamental? And what is left of Sanyal is proof of something that happens more widely in social science. Something is criticized, but it goes on. So there is a critique-proof legacy, both in terms of the idea that primitive accumulation is not a transitional phase of history, but non-post-colonial scholars were saying this a very long time before Sanyal did. And another kind of stream about the need economy, that everything which isn't corporate is non-capitalist, it's non-commodity space. All this is being published and reviewed in journals in the present, that it reproduces subsistence. It's not my understanding of the Indian economy at all. And lastly, that the informal economy is persistent, and that classes in the informal economy, acknowledging a little bit of nuance in class, will persist even if individual growth trajectories are very vulnerable and fragile. Okay. So my last point is that while all this is going on, and while a lot of scholars are very distracted by post-colonial studies and post-colonial political economy, something else has been going on. And India, as well as the country I come from, the United Kingdom, and we're having Israel reaching the headlines every single day, are involved as colonies of an American empire of capital. And so the last point I wish to make, very briefly, is there's a job of work to be done to understand how India in particular, but each of the countries we live in and work and operate in, are parts of the American informal empire of capital, which is following Leo Panich and Sam Ginden's definition, the empire of capital driven by the American state, multilateral institutions, and American capital. We are all informal colonies of this empire. And so the question is how India is incorporated into the American empire, especially after this history of non-alignment, and with what effects in agriculture. And so I can't possibly go through this, but I do want it to be recorded that there was very little before independence, some American activity in India in education, that in the post-independence era, we have soft power being used for hard effects in the economy, We have this spell of technocratic soft power. Everybody studying agriculture knows about it. We then have an American capitalist model which is invading through pre- and post-production sectors of the economy. And in the 21st century, we have the abandonment of the small farmer vision. And agriculture then becomes a poor relation. And I guess the last substantive point I want to make is that we study agriculture, but if we are to study India located in the as a neo-colony, we have to study the military-industrial complex because that swamps agriculture in terms of its relations in the economy. And we also have to study US geo-energy politics. Okay, because again, they have a swamping effect on all the other activity that involves America and Indian agriculture. Conclusions. The post-colonial theory is both ideological and historical. To summarize, it's a critique of Eurocentrism in ideas. And to some extent, it rebalances the culturalist turn that most post-colonial studies has taken. And post-colonial political economy is attempting to do that. Okay.
Mike, please speak to the mic.
But to return to where I started, this is, as you can see, it's a complicated question, and it's very difficult to fit it into 20 minutes. And so what I really conclude after this long spell of reading is that there is no need for post-colonial studies theories of post-colonial capital. We don't need it to do good political economy of India's capitalist agricultural development. But what we need to do is to distinguish the post-colonial from what India developed quite independently of either the British or the American, to respect that, and then to integrate neo-colonial development. And to add to Jens's plea for nuanced study of classes of labor, whatever your theoretical position, either classes of capital or class fractions of capital. I'm sorry I've overdone my limit, but the very last invocation is for us to get our feet muddy and to do field work in the green of the eternal tree of life. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Barbara. My substitute time is over. Dr. T.M. Thomas Isaac will take over the chairship of the session. For the remaining 3 speakers, he'll be the person who will be introducing you and calling you up. Thank you.
Friends, I apologize for being late. There are times when you are not master of your time. That was the situation this afternoon. And Professor Barbara, sorry I missed your talk. It's my loss. Therefore, I have nothing but to say by way of introduction to the next speaker. I invite Deepak Johnson and Sujit to make the presentation on profitability crisis in agriculture, an analysis of trends on costs of cultivation and farm incomes.
Thank you to the Foundation for Agrarian Change for having us here. This is a joint work with Dr. V. Surjit. However, I'll be presenting it for now, and Dr. Surjit and I will take questions later. It's also a tough task to present after Professor Barbara Harris-White on a completely different empirical work, but we'll be mostly focusing on costs and incomes from crop production. So the overview of our presentation is we'll give a little bit of introduction and then straight away get into the data and methods that we use for our analysis. And then we present some important results, and then we plan to end with some discussion and conclude based on the discussion. Now, over the last 2 decades, many scholars have pointed out, based on the analysis of large-scale survey, household survey data, that there has been a decline in real crop incomes, especially after 2012-13, when it comes to 2018-19. And prior to this, there have been a lot of concerns about farmer agrarian distress and farmer suicides, which comrades in the session in the morning talked about. And National Commission on Farmers, headed by Professor M.S. Swaminathan, had noted the crisis in terms of farm incomes and had advocated for evaluating agricultural progress using farmers' income as a yardstick. And in recent years, as you would probably know, doubling farmers' income was something like a slogan which was given. While it has been forgotten, there is some talk still on this need for improving farmers' income in the policy and academic circles, and this gives the motivation for our study. We examined broadly the broad trends in costs and incomes from crop cultivation and identify the components that have contributed to change over time. So in that respect, our questions are fairly descriptive, and we only ask 2 simple questions. How have the net incomes and costs changed for major crops in India from 2001 to 2019-20? And what factors have contributed to the change in costs and incomes? And by factors, we largely mean the components that are included in the costs and income calculation. We do not necessarily go a lot into the external factors per se. Our factors or the components come from the data source that we use for our analysis. Now, specifically for the data and methods, we use the detailed cost of cultivation data for 8 crops between 2001 and 2019-20. Our 8 crops are rice, 3 pulses, arhar, urad, and gram, and 5 oil seeds, sunflower, groundnut, mustard, sesamum, and soybean. Selection of time period is 20 years, which largely coincides with agrarian distress period, early 2000s, and then there was a recovery, and to the recent time when we have the data available at the all India level. And why these particular 8 crops? These crops have been studied regularly over the 20 years, and this broadly account for about 42% of the gross crop area if all the crops are considered. And our data come from the comprehensive scheme for studying the cost of cultivation or production of principal crops in India, or CCPC scheme, which is a scheme, as many of the economists here would know, has been conducted, surveys have been conducted under the scheme annually, and the data are released with a 3-year lag. So we have data up to 2022-23 now, but our analysis is until 2019-20, but even if we include the 2 years after that, the broad pattern remains the same. So before we get into the specific issues with this data source, what do we mean by costs and what do we mean by incomes? So there are 3 cost concepts that have been talked about, at least in the recent literature. The first one is cost A2, or largely called as a paid out cost, which includes cost of hired human labor, owned and hired animal labor, machine labor, seed, manure, all of that. And then cost A2 plus FL. FL stands for family labor. So family labor is not part of cost A2. So if we include the imputed value of family labor that to the cost A2, that becomes cost A2 plus FL. Then cost C2 is cost A2 plus FL plus imputed value of owned land used for cultivation plus other fixed assets utilized in farming. So this is calculated after gathering data on a sampling basis from selected tehsils across different zones which are identified in a state. The coverage and the sampling framework is different, and we'll talk about that a little later. Now, associated with these 3 cost concepts, we have 3 income concepts. The first one is farm business income, which is gross value of output minus cost A2. Gross value of output is the total value of main product and byproduct. Total value of main product is total production multiplied by a price. And net income 1 is the gross value of output minus cost A2 plus FL, and net income 2 is gross value of output minus cost C2. Now, before we get into the results, I would like to talk a little bit about the scheme and how data is available for us to use. It is not the case that all states are studied for all crops. Rice or paddy is by far the most the crop that is studied with the most number of states, and there are only 20 states that are considered here. All the northeastern states are missed out. Many of the oil seeds and pulses, fewer number of states, maybe 5 to 6 or even less than that. And for this, the scheme, CCPC scheme, the blocks, so the states and the crops in which that states have to be studied are fixed for a period of 3 years. And we get estimates at the level of state for every year. And those estimates are weighted according to the area share for this particular crop to arrive at the All India figure. So we are presenting the data only for All India figures, and we report individual year as well as the 3-year average that corresponds to the CCPC scheme cycle. All our costs, incomes are given in rupees per hectare, and in 2019-20 prices, we have adjusted for inflation by using consumer price index for agriculture labor. Now, there are many issues with this data source. There is a critique that this underestimates cost because some of the cost components are not included, plus the sample set of farmers are probably somewhat better off and more equipped to undertake cultivation. So we do not necessarily see probably that many variation in the sample that is selected for this for the survey. There are a reported issue of large variations in yield with that of the official estimate. So this is from the recall method. So yield varies with the official estimates. There are shortcomings in how imputed costs are calculated, especially the land rent. How that land rent is calculated is a question that we can discuss later. And also the interest on working capital and fixed capital. So that's generally a percentage that's fixed, which can vary from if we actually go and measure the interest that the farmers have to pay while undertaking cultivation. So are there any alternate data sources? There is one which is at this scale, situation assessment survey. We present some data from there, but that do not act as a substitute for detailed crop-wise estimate of costs and income. So we do not get crop-wise estimates for different major crops from situation assessment survey, like how we get for every year from the CCPC scheme. Results, again, we present results in 6 themes. We talk about costs, incomes, then what are the components that are driving costs, then yields, MSP and prices, and MSP and costs C2 plus 50%. Now, this is the first graph. If you look at the costs of cultivation, the first green line is basically the paddy costs, and the red one is oil seeds, and blue is pulses. There has been a secular increase. More or less, the long-term trend is that of an increase in costs from 2000 to 2020. And that's, the pattern is similar for all the different crop groups. We have aggregated the 3 pulses into the pulse line. And similarly, for the 5 oil seeds, we only present 1 by using the same methodology that we did for aggregating the state level figures to national level. There is a slight dip towards 2010, from 2005 to 2010, and after that there has been an increase for paddy or rice. That sort of a dip is not so visible for the other 3 groups. In terms of figures, the total cost in 2019-20 prices have jumped from about 30,000 rupees per hectare to about 40,000 rupees per hectare for rice, and pulses and oil seeds have lower costs, as you can see from here. Now, this is the cost story. Now, what do we see in the incomes part? So incomes, very clearly, we see a trend of increasing incomes until 2010-11, and then there has been a fall in incomes. And you can see that the top line is again green. If you look at the paid out costs, it has increased from about 25,000 rupees per hectare in 2000 till about 40,000 rupees per hectare by 2010, and it has fallen down to about 35,000 rupees per hectare. Cost A2 plus FL, that is a net income 1, gives somewhat similar, but if you look at the net income 2, which is by taking into account the opportunity cost of cultivation, that is cost C2, we see that there have been a few years of late when the costs have been much higher than the gross value of output. So we see negative values in that graph, the third panel, towards 2020. So if we actually look at the components of the drivers of rising costs, and costs have risen across time, and we focus on fertilizer costs, human labor costs, and machine labor costs, because these are the 3 major components of cost. We can see that fertilizer costs had, to some extent, reduced a bit by 2010, but then afterwards it increases. Human labor, the most important component, see an increase in terms of costs similar to that of fertilizer, but machine labor costs has seen a consistent increase from about 2,000 rupees per hectare. Now the amount that farmers spent for machine labor for cultivating 1 hectare is about 8,000 rupees. This change in costs in absolute terms is also reflected in cost structure, and the major change has been machine labor has increased across different crops. It has increased from about 10% of the total cost in 2000 to about 20% for rice. Human labor, it continues to be a major share of costs. Now, we see that if you look at the cost A2 plus FL component, we see that the distribution between hired human labor and own human labor or family labor is somewhat same. The rental value of land has accounted for about 22 to 27% of cost C2, but this is ridden with some problems. We can discuss that during Q&A. Now, so we saw the cost part, and costs have been rising. So then what accounts for this peculiar pattern of incomes which has risen up to some level and fallen afterwards? We get into the yields and prices aspect. So yield, this is all indices. We can see that there has been a slow growth of yield, and in absolute terms, oil seeds and pulses have much lower yields. There's a slow growth of yield very clearly, and especially after 2010, there's been sort of like a stagnation, although this graph is somewhat noisy. And in terms of MSP and prices, the first panel shows the price that's actually realized by farmers according to the CCPC scheme. So that's a derived measure, but that gives us an indication of how much farmers would get. And we see that in oil seeds and pulses, there is a lot of variability, but it has not gone up by so much. Whereas MSP, if you look at it, yes, we can see very clearly that while the MSP has been rising, the price realized has remained sort of at same level, with one outlier that was during 2015-16 when we saw a very high price for especially pulses. All right. Now, while we know that price realized is lower, even if MSP gets implemented completely, does it take into account the cost C2 plus 50? Because cost C2 plus 50% was like a benchmark given by the Swaminathan Commission to assure remunerative return for farmers. Now, if you assume that everybody is getting MSP, and even then we would find that MSP as a proportion of cost C2 plus 50 is not 100%. So on the right side, if you see 100, that means MSP is covering the full cost and giving a remunerative return. We see the highest for wheat consistently about 90%, but for paddy and for all the other crops, it's around 70%. Right, now this is about selected crops. What do we see from situation assessment survey? And we have taken all the crops and done some adjustment to make sure that the survey data are comparable across different rounds. And there were only 3 rounds of surveys that were conducted. Now, if you look at the incomes from cultivation, and that first row is for crop production, we see that it has also reduced in absolute terms from 4,000 rupees to about 4,400 rupees to about 4,100 rupees. That's a reduction from 48% of the total income to about 38%, and there has been an increase in wages and salaries component. Now, how does it stand across different classes of cultivators? We have arranged the data according to the land size classification, and 25% of the sample, that is in group 1, cultivate the smallest land holding, and group 4 cultivate the largest land holding. There exists a large variation in the household income for crop production, mainly due to the large land size that the large farmers own. And this is, according to this data, what drives the inequality between agriculture household. Of course, there is a problem with non-agricultural enterprises. The non-farm business incomes may not be really accurately captured, but the variation itself calls for some thinking. Now, to the last point, what are the main points that we get from this analysis? Firstly, there is a problem of stagnating prices, or at least stagnating prices after 2010, and a rising costs, which have put a question mark to the issue of, to the concern of profitability. Now, secondly, at the current levels, it is quite inadequate. Think about rupees 35,000 per hectare, and the average landholding size is about 0.86 hectares. Now, even with 2 crops of rice, the incomes that they would get would be still less than 70,000 rupees for a family for a whole year, which itself is very low. There is different effects of policy, thirdly, that we would like to talk about. Fertilizer prices very clearly was declining until 2010-11 and have seen an increase afterwards, coinciding with the period of decontrolling of price of fertilizer. The influx of private players into the seed markets have partially contributed to the increased prices that we see after 2014-15, especially for seed prices. We do not report the seed costs here, but that could be something that is influencing the costs over time. Fourthly, we clearly see a stagnation in yield growth and high yield gaps that persist. So the all India average yield in rice in 2019 was about 40% lower than the average yield in China. And similarly for oil seeds and pulses, which have very low yield, and low growth of yield, this is something that needs to be addressed. Fifthly, we bring back the point of gaps in price realized by farmers and the MSP, especially for crops like oil seeds and pulses, which see a lot of variability over time, and there do not exist any sort of procurement mechanism that is of the scale that of rice. This is a concern. And finally, to bring everything together, ensuring higher growth in yield is something that has to be perhaps looked into, along with checking input prices and realization of prices that the farmers get on their output. The last point that I would like to end with is, given the inequality in terms of agricultural incomes across different households, what about the poor peasants? That's something that perhaps needs some special attention and some special support measures. Thank you.
Thank you, Deepak Johnson and V. Surjit, for your presentation. May I now invite Surjit Majumdar, Corporate Intervention in Indian Agriculture Sector.
Thank you, Dr. Isaac. I am a bit out of place here in this conference because agrarian studies has never really been my area. I have, however, studied the other part of this particular theme that I'm required to discuss today. But as you shall see, between that and agrarian studies, there's always been such a distance. A common ground has been always difficult to find. So I'm not sure that I have very substantive things to say, but I'd like to make an attempt at trying to understand what has happened in relation to the, so my larger interest has been to look at agriculture as a sector which is an important, on agrarian change, is important in the larger story of capitalist development and industrialization in India. And till the 1991 liberalization process began, even official policy largely recognized the agrarian sector as a constraining sector on that process of development, and policy was all about trying to address that constraint so that capitalist development, particularly the large corporate sector's development, which was in the non-agricultural sector, the constraints on that could be eased. There is, of course, a change after 1991 in the flavor of the discussion about what role agriculture plays within the economy. So if one looks at the policy on paper that evolves with regard to the agricultural sector, agriculture is now seen after 91 as just another area of business. No special feature of agriculture. It's just one of those, just like every other area is being opened up for private capital. The same is going to be true for agriculture. So if one looks at the blueprint of what was supposed to be the policy to be pursued with regard to agriculture, that is a blueprint for a corporate conquest of agriculture. Okay, formulated in the early days of the liberalization process. So almost everything that would be part of that process of a corporate conquest of agriculture was laid out as the objective of policy. So the 2000 National Agricultural Policy, and then the Model Law on Agricultural Marketing that came in 2003, all had that same essential understanding, where agriculture is also one of the sectors being opened up. But if one looks at the reality of what has happened in the 2.5 decades since that particular policy was adopted, at first sight it would appear that agriculture's story is more of continuity than change. So if one looks at the institutional distribution of agricultural production, it is still, as per our national account statistics, dominated by the household sector. Overwhelming domination of the household sector, and the role of the private corporate sector in agricultural production is virtually insignificant. And there is no trend that has gone up in this period of 2.5 to 3 decades of the liberalization period. Across all different segments of agriculture, it is a similar story, that it is the household sector which still dominates. Of course, appreciating the fact that the household sector is not a homogeneous sector. There is a whole range of things that are all captured within that household sector, including large capitalist farmers are also put in the household sector, because the household sector is basically a residual sector. And therefore, it's not to say that it is all small peasant farming, that is all that is happening in agriculture, but certainly corporate agriculture has not come to be established in any significant way in India during this particular period. If one looks at the investment in agriculture also, there too you find that the public sector has a more important role still. Private sector investment in agriculture is very insignificant. So apart from the household sector, it is the public sector which has some contribution to investment in agriculture. The only area where corporate sector dominates is the last one, which is basically investment in software. Okay, that's the only agricultural investment where corporate sector dominates. Otherwise, it has very little role as far as investment in agriculture is concerned. If you look at it from the other side, from the point of view of the private corporate sector, its different fields of activity, there too you find that agriculture is not particularly important. There has been a clear trend. So historically, in the pre-liberalization period, there was a trend for the private big business in India to become increasingly concentrated in manufacturing. Because mining, electricity, financial sector, everything came to be, even telecom, everything was dominated by the public sector. And agriculture was, of course, in the household sector. So the private corporate sector was excessively concentrated in manufacturing activity. That has come down. Non-manufacturing activities have increased in importance, particularly many services, as the public sector has receded. But it is not extended to agriculture. So within the growth of the corporate sector itself during this period, agriculture's share is very, very insignificant. Even though the overall share of the corporate sector, as you can see at the bottom, is something that has become quite significant in the economy. So almost all non-agricultural sectors of the economy, the dominance of the corporate sector has increased significantly, but the same has not been possible as far as agriculture is concerned. Now, of course, this might suggest, as I said, that there's only continuity and no change. It's more or less the same story as far as agriculture is concerned. But in the larger ecosystem surrounding the agrarian economy in India, of course, the significance of the large corporate sector is something that has increased. And there are different ways in which one can see evidence of the implications of that for the agricultural economy, though I'm not in a position to arrive at very firm conclusions about what exactly is the nature of that effect. So on the one hand, we see that sectors, manufacturing activities which process agricultural commodities, okay, it's not that their significance in the economy has increased very much. That large part of agricultural produce is being processed much more now as compared to earlier. That high degree of change is not something that at least the evident data seems to indicate. Much of agricultural production reaches final consumption without going through a large amount of processing. But within the industries which do involve processing of agricultural commodities, what we do see is a trend of increased importance of the corporate sector compared to relatively smaller enterprises, which are unorganized sector enterprises, which may have had a greater significance earlier. So that is one trend that we see, that in terms of agricultural commodities going into the processing of agricultural commodities, the significance of agriculture, of the corporate sector, is something that has increased. If you look at the international agribusiness firms, almost all the major international agribusiness firms that you can think of have, during this period, some of them were there earlier, but almost all of them have established their base in India. So when you look at, okay, is Cargill here, is Louis Dreyfus here, is so-and-so here, they're all here. Okay, so on the face of it, it looks like global agribusiness has arrived in India. But if you look again at the significance of agriculture in the FDI that has come into India, and if you look at its significance of that as far as relative to the size of India's agrarian economy, neither is it very significant. And in fact, it appears that global agribusiness presence in India is more about importing agricultural commodities into India than about either processing or exporting agricultural commodities. They are importing more than they are exporting. That's the nature of that particular thing which we can see from the data. If one looks at the other side of the process, it is possible to make an argument, it's a plausible argument, that the agrarian crisis that was actually the result of the policies that were pursued, okay, that particular agrarian crisis also created conditions in which, of course, those involved in the agrarian economy were looking for ways and means of increasing agricultural incomes. Okay. And the response to that crisis, and larger capitalist farmers and their interests in accumulating have produced certain changes, which was something indicated in the previous presentation, in the use of commercially purchased inputs in agriculture. So on the one hand, we see the use of purchased seeds is something that has increased. Consumption of fertilizers has increased. Consumption of pesticides first declines and then starts increasing. So when you look at the fertilizer sector, of course, India had a large public sector as well as a cooperative sector in fertilizers. But in the last 1 decade particularly, one sees there is a significant rise in the private sector share in fertilizer production. Okay. And of course, as has been mentioned, the implications of that for the prices of fertilizers, the fertilizer subsidy policy has been so altered that it shores up profits of fertilizer companies, but doesn't necessarily provide cheap fertilizer to farmers. Even when you look at seeds, you see the same story, that the share of the private sector is something that has increased significantly. Again, something that was mentioned in the previous presentation, but now it has gone to almost 74% of the supply of certified seeds. So across crops, you see a fairly significant role of the private corporate sector in the supply of seeds. With regard to pesticides, there's no evidence that India's importance as a market for pesticides globally has increased. In fact, it's declined. But what you see at the bottom is something interesting, which is India's significance as an exporter of pesticides is increased. That is, pesticide companies are using India as the base for producing for the international market. It's not being absorbed so much. You don't see a significant trend of absorption in India. So production of pesticides is something that is coming to India, but not as far as the use is concerned. There are two different trends as far as this is concerned. With regard to, of course, the use of, mechanization of agriculture, of course, the supply of machinery is another sphere in which the private corporate sector has historically had an important role. Tractors, of course, being the most important. And there has been a clear trend of increase in mechanization levels in Indian agriculture over this period, with tractors leading that process. And you see a significant growth of tractor sales throughout the liberalization period that has been taking place. And this has, India is one of the largest tractor markets in the world, and Indian tractor companies have become world leaders in tractor production on the basis of that large market. So agriculture has provided an important base for that particular process. So you do see trends where the corporate sector's significance and its influence on the agrarian economy have increased without the conquest of agriculture, in a sense, taking place, in the sense that the policy is actually thought about. I'll finish. No more. So what does that mean in terms of how one understands the corporate intervention in agriculture? I'd like to say this, that the first thing that is, I think, noticeable is that there is a particularly renewed thrust for opening up the agrarian economy to corporate intervention in the last 1 decade or so. And that is seen in this trend of rising importance of private sector, especially in the supply of inputs and capital goods. And of course, also we've seen, like in the case of the farm laws, a renewed policy thrust of opening up the agrarian economy for the corporate sector. I think there's a context to that, which is that this has also been a period in which the agrarian crisis of the 90s and its effects have eventually translated into an accumulation crisis for corporate capital itself. So you have the indications of that are that on the one hand, the investment ratio in India has been falling. Second is industrial sectors, manufacturing importance in the economy has been falling. These are two related trends that you can see. And the process of privatization of all other sectors is more or less done. So Indian capitalism and Indian big business today, in my understanding, is in what I would call a parasitic phase of expansion, where it is not able to find new areas to grow in. So there's a thrust to try and capture whatever part of the economy is left, which is not under corporate control. And the push towards agriculture has a renewed vigor that comes from this. While they had other opportunities to expand, okay, the agrarian reform program didn't quite work out as they thought it would, was not so much a matter of concern. But now, because in a sense agriculture is the last frontier for the corporate sector. So when it has nothing else, no other direction to expand in, really this significance of the agricultural sector is something that is inviting greater attention, and to that extent, conflicts between corporate interests and the agrarian classes are likely to kind of grow and become more intense in the coming period. And there are trends which are indicating that renewed thrust towards agriculture during this period. So with that, I think I've managed within my time. Thank you.
So the final presentation of the session, Mihika Chatterjee, Land in India's Post-Pandemic Accumulation Regime.
Thank you very much to the Foundation of Agrarian Studies for inviting me and giving me this opportunity. I think in many ways that is not the right presentation. I think I've sent the wrong presentation. Sorry, can I just check? And one of the things that we discussed was the importance of the non-farm economy for for agrarian relations. And my research looks at the manufacturing-based industrialization in Western Maharashtra, and the kind of, particularly focusing on industrial areas and industrial corridors, including the DMIC. And what I look at is rural change in Maharashtra. And one of the things that we discussed is that, Sandeepan had a bit of a challenge for me, which was to think about, he's skeptical of the literature that focuses a lot on land dispossession in infrastructure projects. So while we see changes in distribution in land, one of the things that he asked me to think about is the extent to which infrastructure projects have dispossessionary tendencies and the scale of it and how that matters. So that's sort of the starting point of my interest in this topic. The presentation is now fully working. So if we look at the changes in land distribution, one of the ways in which we can look at it is asking about the land question. And here, the Foundation for Agrarian Study publication, Distress in the Fields, shows quite significantly that large-scale household surveys show that there's polarization in land distribution. So there is increase in landlessness on one hand, and there is accumulation of land by large landholders. So that is kind of a trend that we have seen in the last 20 years in India. There is a second stream of literature that also looks at land debates in important ways. And that looks at the process of land dispossession as well as commodification, which is related to the more spatialized industrial strategies, including industrial corridors and other infrastructure projects like special economic zones, which do not hold as much sway anymore in policy circles, but ports and highways. So both these literatures are talking to how land is distributed and the kind of pressures of dispossession that emerge, of course with very different explanations. So on one hand, we have explanations of, process of agrarian change and differentiation. We have the dispossessionary pressures that come from very class-specific agrarian crisis. And also there is a general idea of a structural retrogression in agriculture. So, the idea of agrarian distress and crisis within profitability in agriculture that we have been talking about leads to a kind of pressure on land, particularly in the hands of marginal farmers who sell off their lands in response to this agrarian distress. And there are similar kinds of understandings about how dispossession might be an outcome of big state-led land projects, but also that after these state-led land projects, there might be, it might trigger its own set of dynamics of differentiation through speculation, following announcements of big projects, etc. So my argument is to not look at, and my aim really is to think a little bit about what's happening to land distribution by looking at the kind of crisis of accumulation outside of the farm. We speak a lot about farm agrarian distress and agrarian crisis in the rural areas and how that leads to these changes. But I want to relationally integrate the crisis of accumulation outside the farm to understand the distribution and forces of production in the countryside. So when I think about the larger political economy of India, particularly 2010 onwards, and I'm using that time period primarily because we have a sense of understanding that India did particularly well was fairly resilient to the 2008 the global financial crisis. But what we see from 2010 onwards is that there has been a decline in growth rates. And even though India showed the resilience in 2008, there has also been a stagnation in industrialization, which has been mentioned several times in the last couple of days. Although there's a contradiction there where even though there has been a stagnation of manufacturing, there has been a thrust to these spatialized industrial strategies to build more corridors and to attract foreign direct investments, particularly in that area. There is also a kind of a choke point along the financial flows that we have been seeing in the last decade, particularly when we look at foreign direct investment, and I will discuss that a little bit later into the presentation, which was hit hard after the pandemic. But this general accumulation regime where there is a thrust towards manufacturing, yet we see a stagnation in industrialization, the decline of growth rates, I want to particularly focus on the industrial aspect of that. And here I think it can be disaggregated into a stagnation within manufacturing and a kind of a slowdown in construction specifically. So if we look at the manufacturing stagnation, and there are many ways of thinking about manufacturing stagnation, but the average annual growth rate, particularly between 2012 and 2020, has been about 3.5%. But if we zoom in further, during this phase, we look at manufacturing growth rates in somewhere in between, we see that it fell from 13% per annum in 2015-2016 to 0.9% in 2019-2020. There are multiple reasons for it. There are global factors, and there is a global political economy of shifting production regimes that have been important. Some of the manifestation of this is that very often we will hear that India's manufacturing needs have been replaced by exports from China or Vietnam and Bangladesh in the case of textile. So there is a general change in the geography of global production. There are also domestic causes for this stagnation. So there has been, one of the arguments is that there has been an increase in import intensity despite a push towards Make in India. And that this increase in import intensity has been both in the production and consumption of goods since 2010. So, everything from phones to parts for solar projects have been imported. Quite importantly, there's also a technological slag that the manufacturing industry has particularly seen. In 1996, just because China is always now a source of comparison, in 1996, China and India spent about 0.6% of their GDP on research and development, which has remained at the same level for India, but has quadrupled in China. So there are these set of factors that have led to this, what we call the stagnation in manufacturing. If we think a little bit further about manufacturing and we look at the construction industry, and I mentioned the construction industry because it is one of the more labor-absorptive part of the industrial sector. Also because I look at infrastructure corridors and industrial areas where construction is the most labor-absorptive component of the post-dispossession outcomes that come about. And if you look at that, we see that, well, I mean, in general, manufacturing shares have been declining. But when we look at some of the general growth figures in industrialization per se, we might see them rising. And that rise primarily comes from construction. But there has been a construction slump. And its significance is because it does absorb, it is an important source of rural labor. And when we look at the share of construction, so it's gross value added to GDP, that has remained fairly stable in the last decade or so. The ability of construction to absorb the rural surplus, relative surplus population from rural areas varies vastly across different parts of the country. Here again, we look at different sets of factors as to what is happening in the construction slump, which is that there is a kind of a global slowdown, particularly in the form of FDI, which has gone down from its peak of 3.4% in 2008-2009 to about 2%. Particularly within that, the role of private equity has actually been quite important in looking at the proportion of foreign direct investment. It was as high as 70% of foreign direct investment around 2008-2010. And this becomes important because private equity very often does not invest in greenfield investments within factories. It invests for short times, and then when the slump hits, it usually withdraws. And that has been a part of the story of the slump in the construction sector. But I don't want to focus too much on the slump because as we have seen earlier in presentation, there has also been a revival. One of the other manifestations of looking at this anxiety of finances for manufacturing, particularly construction, is if we think about the Indian state's involvement in financing infrastructure. So public-private partnership has been an important policy thrust for a very long time for infrastructure. But this really slowed down after 2012. And multiple reasons have been stated, including the risk-sharing imbalances between the public and the private sector aspect of it, which has sort of motivated policies like central government policies and schemes like the National Infrastructure Pipeline, which was launched in 2019 because of the slump of investment in infrastructure. And one of the aims of this NIP is that it expects to fund roughly 39% of the funding from the central government, 40% from the state governments, in order to attract the remaining from the private sector. So all of this context that these political economic factors, I would like to suggest that it leads to a kind of a non-farm crisis. And one manifestation of that is that we have seen that, particularly when COVID hit around 2020, there has been a kind of a shift in agriculture. The share of workers employed in agriculture, even in rich states like Kerala. So in Kerala, for example, it has gone from almost 20% in 2017-18 to 27% in 23-24. So we do see a kind of a rising share of employment in agriculture, though that can be disaggregated, and we can look at the male-female share of that, as we did in the previous presentation, in the previous panel, and there are many reasons to that. But the main thing that I'm trying to argue here is that the non-farm crisis, if we understand that as a deceleration in labor-intensive industrial sectors like garment or construction, and if we agree that it expels footloose labor, then that has its agrarian articulations. And it manifests as crisis of social reproduction for classes of labor, so everybody from all people from landless laborers, petty commodity producers. It reshapes the modalities of rural accumulation, and I will explain that in a bit. And it also leads to a kind of extractive ecological pressures on land, primarily through tenancy arrangements. And here I'm going to refer a little bit to my research in Maharashtra. So my aim in the rest of the presentation is to read the trends in land distribution through the agrarian articulations of this non-farm crisis. And here, I mean articulation, not just in the Althusserian way of the farm crisis and the non-farm crisis coming together, but also as a given, but the fact that the non-farm crisis gives it an expression that is socially and politically important in terms of how that can be mobilized for politics around agrarian relations. So my first argument is that if you look at small holdings, and this is, again, I'm referring back to the distress in the fields and FAS's important work, the exact trends in small holdings vary by region, and official estimates tend to overestimate small holdings particularly. So village studies give more accurate pictures. And it is also the case that mainstream policy the main thrust of it has been to rationalize what is, I think, erroneously categorized as uneconomic and unviable land holdings. An example of that is the Land Leasing Act by the Haq Committee, for example. Or there is a very often there is an idea that farmers want to exit farming, and this preference is spoken of in the abstract. So the way to think about small holdings, keeping in mind the accumulation crisis in the non-farm sector, is that the semi-proletarian condition has to be thought of in slightly different ways. And here I'm looking at Michael Levine and Alessandra Mazzadri's recent work. There is, of course, the dynamics of agrarian distress and land sales. So there is a kind of force of partial dispossession that happens that leads to the semi-proletarian condition. But in terms of the importance of, and here the semi-proletarian condition, of course, does not hold its meaning in its traditional sense, which is that the semi-proletarian condition was thought of as land that subsidized social reproduction for capital, and it was functional to capital's needs. But we can think about, we need to think about semi-proletarianization as something that is functional and quite important to the crisis of social reproduction for small farm holders. And it is quite important to think about that, rather seeing this as a permanent state of reverse migration that the non-farm crisis leads to. Because as we saw in the previous presentation, and here, this relates to Dr. Avinash Tripathi's presentation on the interpretation of trends from national surveys. One of the things that he said is that weight series show volatility and post-shock rebound in construction with cyclical catch-up, but this is not a structural gain. So in that, keeping that in mind, the semi-proletarian condition remains functional to the crisis of production. And so just to think of it as something that is important to capital, because capital can lead to, does not need people to rely on land to control disciplined labor. We have the absence of labor codes and labor regulations to do that. But land is, land, however marginal, is becoming central to addressing the crisis of reproduction. So that's sort of my first reading of the prevalence of small holdings. The second point that I want to raise is about the increasing trend of tenancy. So there are village surveys as well as some national surveys that show that the percentage of operational land holdings that are partially or wholly leased in was 9.9% in 2002-2003, but it is about 17% now in 2008-2019. And of course, there is variation in how tenancy arrangements work and the extent to which they allow for accumulation and social reproduction. But there is a case-specific point that I want to make, particularly in relation to my research on rural industrialization in Maharashtra. So I'm looking at industrial zones that do house manufacturing units. So some of the manufacturing units that have come there are packaging for pharmaceutical, plastic manufacturing, as well as assembly of cars. Hence my interest in looking at what's happening in the manufacturing sector. And then this manufacturing zone is now being absorbed into the Delhi-Mumbai industrial corridor, and there is an upgrading of the kind of industries that are meant to come about there. And I look at surveys of 5 villages, and I look at the kind of outcomes that come about across different classes of farmers. And one of the things that I observe is the post-dispossession trajectories for those who had capitalist farmers who had about 8 hectares or more land in this particular, in 5 villages that made them capitalist farmers in terms of their dynamics of accumulation. And what they do with the compensation money after they get, after either part of their land or a lot of their land is acquired. And there is a scramble to replace land with more land. And as the value of land increases in the villages where these announcements are made and where the zones do come about, very often they will go and invest land in faraway villages where they operate as absentee landowners and get into tenancy arrangements, which in this particular case is horizontal within the caste. So it is the kind of tenancy that works within the same class group as well as within the same caste. And as well as sharecropping is the primary source of rent that is that is used in these tenancy arrangements. And if we look at these tenancy arrangements, one of the ways of thinking about is actually from the point of view of the rural capitalist farmers, where I suggest that this tenancy is actually a question of crisis of rural accumulation for farmers. So it is more of an agrarian question of capital, not in the sense that, what happens to the agrarian transition in the classic sense of the debate, but more in terms of what the accumulating farmers are doing with their surplus. So what happens to their trajectories of diversification and what they can do. And one of the things that I observe is that particularly after COVID is that once there is a slump in the non-farm sector, very often this leads to an intensification of tenancy arrangements. Others have also found similar kind of settings. So I think I will just end quickly with the implications. I think I wanted to integrate the crisis of accumulation outside the farm to understand the tenancies and land distribution. And one of the things that I want to say is that the persistence of small holdings, increasing miniaturization, and tenancy linked to the semi-proletarian condition are not residues of non-capitalist social relations and norms that exist alongside capitalism proper. These are better understood as a crisis of both farm and non-farm growth under neoliberalism. And in terms of implications for politics, I'm just going to leave it there because I think that would lead to a fruitful discussion. Thank you.
That leaves us 15 minutes for discussion. Well, the purpose presented in this session has been slightly disparate themes, But nevertheless, a common thread running through the papers are how does capital, particularly corporate capital, non-farm capital, its accumulation crisis affect agriculture sector. So this is broadly the theme of the papers presented. So those who want to comment on it or raise questions, feel free to do so. Since the time is limited, try to be brief. Is the mic hand mic? Yes, I would also like to have a hand mic here.
Perhaps I can speak loud enough to be heard. Can I don't know. Barbara, I think I'm going to show not merely that I am sort of pre-post, but perhaps positively antediluvian. Thank you. Not only pre-post, but positively antediluvian. You said that you thought the mode of production debate never sort of reached a conclusion. I think for me it did really, with Jairus Banerjee's great paper of 1977 on the Deccan peasantry in the later 19th century. And that makes me sort of reflect upon what has seemed to me, in some ways, to be an absence from much of the discussion, or much of the discussion that you were talking about, and that for me has perhaps been missing in some of the other recent discussions, including some of those we've heard here, which is that I don't hear any more about the role of merchant capital in the agricultural economy. And as somebody who has sort of contributed a great deal on the study of merchant capital in the agricultural economy, I'd be interested in your comment on sort of, in a sense, what's happened to merchant capital in the sort of thinking that you reviewed in your very interesting presentation.
How do we go about? Shall we take 2-3 questions, then the panelists respond? That would be better. So, please.
A quick question for Deepak. Well, two things. One, why did you choose those crops? I was interested in why you didn't do cotton. It would seem a very interesting study. I wondered why cotton wasn't in your study. Second thing, do you have to discount, you're talking about opportunity costs of labor, particularly in terms of household labor, etc. Do you also calculate within that the food subsistence amount from at least the pulses and the rice coming in? Is that something you adjust for? And a quick question for Barbara. You mentioned the concept of post-colonial capital, but obviously the one that is really big at the moment is the idea of racial capitalism. You cannot throw a stone in British or North American academia without hitting someone talking about racial capitalism. I hate to commit you to a further year's study, but I wondered how does racial capitalism sit alongside the concept of post-colonial capitalism? Thank you.
One more.
I thanks to Professor Barbara Harris-White and also other speaker, but my question is centered to Professor, very thought-provoking presentation. Just I want to add her that actually that what happened in Shingu border, in the peasant movement, you skipped, your presentation does not address that for the first time in India, even the agricultural laborer and the so-called Green Revolution farmers, they come to a same platform to challenge the corporate agriculture. And so the mode of production debate, earlier mode of production debate is completely, I think, reversed. And as Professor Utsa Patnaik also in her article said that arrested development of capitalism. So it opens a new chapter of debate. And I have particularly problem with your theorization of petty commodity production that I wrote also in essays in honor of Professor Utsa Patnaik. That's separate. But what is, how do you address this question, this problem?
Professor Barbara, would you?
Professor Harris.
Shall I? Can I butt in here with a question as well to Mihika? Thanks for this interesting presentation that I really think pushes our attempt to understand the relationship between agrarian and non-agrarian development. I wonder, is there a reason why you didn't include the service sector? Because the picture wouldn't have looked quite the same if you had included the service sector. The crisis was, of course, primarily in construction and in manufacturing. The service sector has more or less recovered. So would the argument stand if you look at the non-agrarian sector per se, or is there a reason why you didn't do it that way?
Thanks. This is a question to Professor Barbara Harris-White. This is regarding here, ma'am. This is regarding Kalyan Sannal's 2007 book and work by Snehashish Bhattacharya and Surbhi Keshar and so on. Ma'am, given the fact that in Indian labor market, more than 50% of our workforce are self-employed. So how do you deal with the question of capital labor in case of self-employed people? This is one of the major questions which they raised. So if you can throw some lights on that. Thank you.
This is not a question as such, but in the context of presentation by Deepak and Surjit, the concern regarding profitability in cultivation, particularly the case of the peasantry being so precarious, and perhaps what Professor Jens was speaking in the morning session regarding the interrelation between the agrarian and the non-agrarian sector. I would like to add to that my experiences in the village survey in Uttar Pradesh regions, in the eastern and Bundelkhand, the southern part of Uttar Pradesh. In about 189 households I have surveyed, the reality was, yes. All right, okay. Yeah, I'll just, I mean, I already told that this is just an addition to that. All right. So that being so precarious a scenario that hardly 18% of the households actually generate any kind of surplus there. So I just took A2 only as the cost component, but there even that was the kind of reality that was seen. And this was in a way aggravating the agrarian interdependence, and the kind of forced, livelihood diversification was seen, and the condition of the poor peasantry was really, really precarious. So that is just an addition to that. But I'd like to have one question: why you have avoided the wheat crop from that analysis? That's fine. Thank you.
Yes, I think now we'll move to the responses. But do respond first, yeah.
I had one question to Professor Majumdar. Yeah, Professor, you mentioned that global agribusiness in India is more concerned about importing agri commodities instead of manufacturing for the domestic market here. Could you throw some light on what are these commodities? Does it fall into the certain explanations given about how certain countries are tropical, certain countries produce temperate commodities? So is global agribusiness exploiting that divide in terms of importing certain commodities which are not produced here, or is it something else? So some light on that.
Thank you for all the questions. Actually, I'm quite deaf, and the sound distorts what people say, so I haven't heard all of the questions. I will answer the questions that I did hear. The first was from John about, well, in the end asking about merchants, capital, and the relationship between merchants, capital market systems, and production. And my answer is that post-colonial political economy, which locates itself in post-colonial studies, doesn't really go there. The study of merchants' capital, commercial capital, awkward classes, is very well covered in classical political economy. So that's a quick answer, but the corollary was a personal question about what has happened. Capital-biased, capital-subsidized concentration in the post-harvest system, stratified fractions of capital, stratified by activity, by size, by caste, quite discrete fractions of capital in the post-harvest systems have persisted. Petty trade has also proliferated, as we can see with our own eyes wherever we travel in India. So much so that it's an ultra-simplification to say that there are two kinds of expansion of capitalism in India, but it's useful to think with. One is accumulation, Moses and the prophets, centralization, family business, but there is no statistical record that shows anything other than a vast and constant expansion in India. It's as though there are two trajectories side by side. Call them non-capital, and I don't think you really understand the way in which small units are incorporated, inextricably incorporated in capitalist markets. Now we have the Adani phenomenon. We have a new scale of capital threatening agricultural market systems. Does it actually signal the red light for small family business? Not if they relocate themselves as agents for big capital, which is certainly happening. But in many cases, these families have latterly invested in education for sons, and sons are now branching out into the professions, IT, and so on and so forth. So it may be, it's a very, very live empirical question, what's happening to small family business. The next question was about racial capitalism versus caste. Now, in the wider North American post-colonial studies literature, this is important, but I didn't discuss it because it doesn't actually map onto the way in which it's been discussed in India. But there is a big debate about whether you can accommodate caste under racial capitalism, and certainly in the politics of Australia, Britain, America, caste is being accommodated as a protected characteristic against discrimination under the bigger heading of race. But there are very, very big differences between caste and tribe in India and race as conceived in North American racial capitalism. It's an ascribed characteristic. You cannot see caste, although some of us think we can. And what it actually means in the economy depends on the position of the person concerned in the hierarchy or system, or whatever you like to call it, of caste. So there's significant differences. And I think Dalits have done everybody a provocative service by conjecturing about a caste mode of production. You may disagree, but it forces you to think about the materialization of caste under capitalism. So there were several questions I didn't hear properly, but one was about petty commodity production, and I'm not sure what the actual question was, but the point was very correct. that it's the commonest form of livelihood in India. And we call it sort of subsistence, or we marginalize it, or because it's very small, we don't consider it seriously. Now, it is capital and labor in a unit of production. That's what it is. So for classical Marxism, it's difficult to accommodate, and it's easiest for people to call it disguised wage labor. But if you look at what Marx himself wrote about petty commodity production, there were three problematics. One was that it was in transition to the polar classes of capital. It's transitory. But clearly it's not transitory in India. And so the two other problematics of Marx come into play. One was that it suits capital. If you like, it's functional. I don't care if you call me functionalist. It's useful for capitalism to create spaces for petty commodity production, where production can be done using unpaid labor at lower cost than if it were done in a factory. But lastly, there's the American example, in the settler example, which Marx considers very seriously, where all the settlers tried to employ wage labor, but wage labor said, we're going off to settle our own land, thank you very much. So in the settlement of America, there was a constant shortage of labor, and Marx had to concede that in that case, and I think it's highly relevant to India, for different reasons, there was a form which was both autonomous and self-exploitative, where the exploitation is not on labor markets, it's on markets other than labor. And this is why self-employment needs to be taken seriously by all of you. Because if you call it labor, as so many people do, it therefore behoves self-employment to behave politically like labor and engage in labor politics. But how do you map a minimum wage, for instance, onto an enterprise which is not paid through the labor market? It's actually engaging with rental markets, raw material markets, markets for finished products. Nobody's ever really carried through the implications of that for a minimum return. Yeah? You get the point. It's not the same as labor, and its politics are not the same as labor politics. I could say a lot more.
Thank you. Questions? I didn't hear the first question, Marcus, very clearly, but the interest of, why these crops specifically, we were largely interested in issues of crop diversification and oil seeds and pulses being something that is suggested commonly. We just wanted to include that along with rice. But the pattern that we see is more or less same. Even when we include wheat, I don't think the pattern is going to differ so much. About the cost and what is paid to the family. Cotton, of course. Cotton is part of the database, but we haven't done the analysis. So, yeah. And about the cost paid to the family labor, wages are imputed, the prevailing wages are taken as wages that's paid for the family labor, and it does not include subsidies or other kind of thing that's added to it. Yeah, that's all.
Well, from the data source that was used, it's not possible to determine exactly what they are importing, but I suspect it is imports that are related to changing consumption patterns at the top end of the Indian income distribution. So certain sections changing consumption patterns leading to space for imports. That's the area that they seem to be focusing on rather than the large mass of the agricultural sector.
I want to raise your question. It's not okay. Is it not better to look at it, the process that you are examining, from the framework of a pauperization process? Your argument is that because of the crisis of accumulation, the employment opportunities in, say, industrial sector has been very limited. Therefore, population is forced to subsist in the agriculture. Okay, that raises population pressure, results in fragmentation. And if you look at the recent PLF surveys, the increase in the employment has been entirely in the, say, subsistence unpaid activities of women, you see. So is it not better to view this from a process of pauperization rather than proletarianization?
Thank you. I think, Jens, thanks for that question. I focused on manufacturing and construction specifically, partly because I started empirically and started from the kind of jobs that the non-farm jobs that were absorbing the villages and the dispossessed households in the case of the infrastructure corridor in that part of the region. I think part of it was also that there has been a bit of an optimism around the extent to which construction can absorb labor. So the initial thrust was to look at the, how the booms and busts and the cyclical nature of construction employment itself, what that means for migratory rural forces and classes of labor. But I do think that if I did include services, it would look different for different regions in India, and I think it is an important question in terms of how it would change. For the marginal landholders, and particularly those who are the classes of labor that are moving in and out of agriculture, I don't know if the drive to hold on to marginal pieces of land and doing that even if one has to go into further indebtedness is going to change if I integrate services into the equation. So the articulation of this non-farm and farm crisis I'm talking about through land, that might not necessarily change significantly, but yes, I think the ratios of the relative surplus population that's floating around would change if I looked into services as well. So I very much hoped that I communicated the relational aspect of the non-farm and the farm process. So I definitely see it very much as a process. Insofar as the difference between pauperization, why I didn't use pauperization and why I'm using semi-proletarianization is partly because that the semi-proletarian condition has come back in debates around agrarian relations in relation to classes of labor, as well as just the importance of land in South Africa, India, and other parts of the world, of the global South. In that, very much the conversation is about the extent to which it clings on to the original thesis. I don't think all the semi-proletarian households necessarily have been pauperized in the sense that there is an intersectional caste gender dimension to pauperization that I think makes it quite a distinct concept and an important political concept. So to club it under the kind of semi-proletarianization category that I'm talking about would be actually to blunt pauperization. So that would be, I would say that's why I think it's important to retain the semi-proletarian condition as its own.
So thank you very much. That brings the session to a close. We have already overshot by 10 minutes. Thank you very much.